Good evening, everyone, and welcome to EduTALK. EduTALK is a bi-monthly virtual talk show created out of the need for a global learning community focused on topics in education that directly impact Caribbean nations and the diaspora nationals working across the globe. EduTALK features teachers, principals, administrators, business leaders, and dignitaries who share their expertise on critical topics facing education today, with the common goal of moving education forward and our students upward. My name is Dr. Dwayne Dice, your host. I am founder and chief executive officer of Education Solutions International. Please visit educationsolutionsinternational.org to learn more about how ESI, that is Education Solutions International, supports students, educators, and school communities. And please subscribe to receive ESI updates. Today, we are joined by Mr. Rene Jimenez to EduTalk. Mr. Jimenez is middle school information specialist and the student life coordinator at the Dalton School. I have the great privilege of working with him, and he's here to talk to us about critical race theory. Welcome, Mr. Jimenez, to our program.
Thank you, Dr. Dwayne Dice. The privilege is mine.
Yes, you're welcome. And I'm so happy that you can join us because I want you to tell us just a little bit about yourself, where you are from, and briefly how you grew up and school and so on before we get into the program.
Yeah, definitely. So a lot of people will think I'm a New Yorker. I've lived here for quite some time. I think I've been in the United States for 24 years now. But I was actually born in Dominican Republic, was there till 4. So part of my elementary education was there. So after that, I moved to the United States. I lived in New York, bounced around to Connecticut for schooling, and then back to New York City for college. So just a quick background and overview as to what my education background was and my experience was. Elementary school in Dominican Republic was Catholic school. So my education was a Catholic school education up until I was 4.5, when my parents decided to move to New York City. At that time, I enrolled at a public school in our local neighborhood, all the way up until 4th grade. And 5th grade, my 4th grade teacher was leaving our current school environment and told my parents, like, hey, I am opening up a new school. I think Rene would be a great fit for this place. And it was a charter school. So I was part of the first graduating class of the KIPP charter school system in New York City. So the first school in Harlem was part of, in 2003, was part of what I started and where I went. So from 2003 to 2007, I was in a charter school system for middle school. And out of that kind of just came a need and a desire to just explore something different in the field of education. And I think my parents were very supportive in that fact that that's what they wanted me to do. So I decided to go to boarding school. So I went to a private school in New England, in Connecticut, for 4 years. And that's where I was for high school. Then I came back to New York, and then I enrolled at CUNY, which is City University of New York. So I enrolled at City College of New York. I got my undergraduate degree there. So I have a double major with a sub-concentration. So I majored in international studies, Latin American studies, and communications and culture while I was there. Fast forward 5 years after graduating, I'm currently in my master's program of education policy at Teachers College in Columbia. I am currently in my first year, second semester. So just wrapping up the first year of my master's degree. And then after that, I'll have 1 more year left to go. So
wow, good job.
Thank you. So it's been a journey, it's been a ride, but I think the experiences that I've had in all these different school systems are very drastically different it's very day and night, depending what school you're going to, comparing public schools to charter schools, and then even comparing charter schools to private schools and vice versa. I think there's some overlap, but there's a worlds of a difference in sort of just the environment, the community you're in, and the kind of education you receive.
Right, right, right. Yeah, that's very true. The kind of education you receive, for real. So you're from the Caribbean. So shout out to Caribbean people right across the board, and also shout out to people who are in Columbia University. So I want to ask you, because you are a man of color in America, and you have heard the term critical race theory before. Um, what does that really mean to you when you look at the studies around critical race theory, and everybody's talking about it these days? What is it that is about critical race theory?
I think it's critical race theory, and it's interesting in the fact that this is now probably, if you Google it, it's probably one of the most Googled words and one of the most Googled terms out of the last 2 years, right? And if you approach anyone on the street, they're like, "Oh, critical race theory!" Like, it's the first thing that comes to mind. And it's, to them, seems like a relatively new term, but it's not. I think for me, the conversations and the disagreements and arguments around critical race theory are based on ignorance, right? And it's not just ignorance in the ability to not want to just like come to the table and discuss these things. It's ignorance on what actual critical race theory is. This is something that's been around since the mid-70s. This is not a new topic. We're in 2022. So
Right.
if my math is correct, Dr. Dice, I think we're 52 years of CRT being alive, and this being something that's been discussed in academic circles. So this is not a relatively new term. I think calling it critical race theory for people seems kind of, it's a gasp. Like, people are like, "Oh no, like, we really shouldn't be talking about this." But at the core of it, I think if we really look at what critical race theory is, and it's and we have a lot of American legal scholars, Derek Bell, Alan Freeman, Kimberly Crenshaw, and I think Kimberly Crenshaw is one that really sticks out, not just because of the work that was done here, but of everything else. Like, that name in the academic circles, especially for men of color, in what I've learned and what I studied, Kimberly Crenshaw was very important in my education. But if we really look at what these American scholars were talking about, critical race theory was in itself a critique of critical legal studies. And as policy analysts, like, one of our jobs is to really analyze theories and policies and say, like, hey, does this actually work for us? Does it work for people? Who's winning? Who's getting what? When are they receiving this? And CRT really came out of the fact that we're looking at critical legal studies and we're like, there's something missing here. And what's missing is how critical legal studies, how do we look at race? How does race play into this? How does the intersectionality of race provide a lens for people to look at law? And the reality of this was that it doesn't. Critical legal studies really focus on the rule of law, what the word said, what the Constitution said. But if we look at the Constitution, there were mentions, like, this is why we have so many amendments, right? Like, the Constitution was not a perfect piece of paper. There's 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments were things that came to light because of a necessity to acknowledge a whole group of people that were not acknowledged as human beings in America. They were acknowledged as property, and then eventually were acknowledged as 3/5 of a person for a vote. And then after civil rights movements and different movements that came out of that, they were then fully emancipated and acknowledged as people. But the law to this day, like, if we look at Plessy versus Ferguson and then Brown versus Board of Education, like, these are things that the law was very big on. Like, if we talk about Plessy versus Ferguson, this was not the first time that the segregated rail cars was brought up. Brown versus Board of Education, everyone knows about Brown v. Board, but there's Brown v. Board 2, right? That's the one that we talk about. But Brown v. Board 1 enforced segregation. And it was just a couple of years of a difference before the court was like, oh, we don't enforce segregation, but this is the rule of the law. This is how the law was interpreted. So I think CRT just came out of a need to include race and include people of color in the conversation.
Mhm.
And I think the apprehension to use the term and to discuss the term now comes from ignorance, and
Yeah.
it's this fear of replacing a predominant race. It's the fear of removing whiteness from America and replacing it with blackness, and that's not what CRT is asking for. CRT is asking for centering whiteness in the discussion and understanding that whiteness has privilege over blackness.
Yeah.
Um, and how we can then look at public policy and say, this is not good policy for people of color because of X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, yeah. And one of the other questions I was gonna ask you, that's very good overview of what it is, because a lot of people thinking that they use the term cancel culture, like we're canceling a one particular culture or group of people because we're talking about critical race theory. But I love the angle that you're taking here. It's very neutral to look at the concept itself.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, can you expound a little bit on what do they mean by cancel culture when they're saying that, oh, it's like they're apprehensive about the fact that that if we discuss it, then we're canceling a culture.
Right. I think and cancel culture in itself is it's an interesting phenomenon, right? I think people are just scared of saying something that may seem racist because I don't want to be canceled. And what does that really mean, being canceled,
Mhm.
right? And I think people are more scared of, I don't want to lose my job, or I don't want people to think I'm a racist, or I don't want people to walk around saying I'm not going to associate with this person because this person doesn't necessarily believe about race as certain things. And when we talk about CRT, we're not asking for a cancellation of a white culture. We're not asking for a cancellation of white people. We're
Mhm.
asking for equal members at the table. We want people of color to have the same voice as white people. But then also we want to dispel a lot of the misinformation and a lot of the learned behavior that is associated with both ends, right? I think there's an interesting concept of just looking at the predominance of whiteness. And when people think about critical race theory, some people are scared that what we're trying to do is subjugate white people to be lesser than. And
Mhm.
the reality of the case is that's not what we're asking for. That's not what CRT is looking at. CRT just really wants to center the discussion around race and to show people how different institutions and policies and programs have not taken race into account and are only favoring one side,
Mhm.
right? And I think it's, for me at least, in my personal experience with CRT, it's more about leveling the playing field,
Yeah.
bringing people to, I think the best analogy I can think of is you have a whole bunch of people on a football field, but everyone has different sport equipment and they're all playing very different games. The
Yes.
goal here is to bring people to the field with the same equipment, give them the same tools, and let them understand, yes, right, like as a Black person, these are the abilities that I have. Like as an educated Black man and an educated white man, we may be playing the same sport now, but there's different obstacles in this field. And this is what CRT really wants to look at. CRT really wants to focus on, why is the field different for people of color than it is for white people? And how
Yeah.
can we make it an even playing field for both?
It's kind of like what Martin Luther King said, that you ask a man to pull himself up by his bootstraps, but then you don't even give him a boot in the first place
Right,
after making all that money from his effort, building your cities and so on, and taking away actually the opportunity to buy a boot, and then telling him to lift himself up by his bootstraps when he doesn't even have a boot on his
right.
feet. So you have to level the playing field.
Mhm.
That's pretty good. Oh, how does this play into the concept of when people say that America is built on racism, or is institutionalized racism, or systemic racism? How is critical race theory play a part in that, or to understand that concept? Because we don't want
Right.
to beat people over the head and say, you're racist, you know, but to understand the whole idea of systemic racism, or that is the derogatory term that is used. Because to me, it sounds like if you say a system, an entire country is built on racism, is saying that the whole construct of it is racist. but to understand it in critical race theory format?
I think critical race theory is a beautiful mechanism to understanding how racism is institutionalized in America. And there's a difference between like saying there's institutionalized racism and calling people racist. I think there's a large group of people that I know that are not racist, but benefit from institutionalized racism. Do they know that they're benefiting from that? No. And I think that's what critical race theory does, is brings that to light. It shows like, hey, these are institutions that have been benefiting from racism for centuries. And whether or not you know it, you are exploiting this. And that doesn't make you a racist. That's not saying that my white counterparts are racist because they are working at the same place that I'm working at, and that they're getting more benefits, right? Like it's about critical race theory really focuses on how these institutions came to be and how these institutions were focused in their creation in excluding people of color. And that in itself is institutionalized racism, because there's some institutions that, till this day, yes, that are integrated, but at what level are we talking about integration? Because some places are not, or could be racially integrated, but are not class integrated, right? And you have a very distinct cut as to people who can afford certain things and people who cannot.
Yeah.
So I think using critical race theory, we can point out areas of growth in different institutions and say, hey, for example, like one of the biggest things is the medical field. Pregnant Black women are at risk at a higher level than pregnant white women of suffering during their pregnancy or losing their life during childbirth. And this in itself is because, to a certain extent, institutionalized racism. Like, how do we assign value to a Black mother and a Black child is really derivative of how America came to be. And it's super important in education. We have it in school zones. We have it in district school zones where only a certain group can go to a certain area. New York City is a prime example of that, where you have public schools that are much better in the Upper East Side than in Crown Heights in Brooklyn, or even in Harlem, maybe like 100-block difference. And how schools are districted and how attendance zones are created and how certain schools are put in different areas to attract a certain amount of people. And I think people are just scared to use CRT in that lens to kind of see the world and view it, because people don't want to make it all about race, right? And I get it. I hear that. And people are like, well, race is a social construct. 100% race is a social construct, right? I'm not disagreeing with that. But the effects of race, regardless of the fact that it's a social construct, is still a very tangible thing. Racism is very tangible. The trauma of slavery is still very tangible. So yes, these things are a social construct, but their effects on our lives are very tangible and they're very real. And I think we look at it and we have to talk about racism in America. And it's not just racism in America is not just a product of one person's prejudice or personal bias. We have to look at the fact that it's embedded in our legal system and in public policy too.
Yeah. Very, very, very good. Yeah. And all of these tenets that you're mentioning, we can spend a whole long time on each of them discussing. Like, we could pick one of those topics and talk in length about the idea that they exist and some other description and content around the ideas that you created. Opening up these are really opening up a can of worms. It's just opening up our ideas to further discussion. So you talk. I'm really enjoying it. The discussion too, and your sharing. What do you think about education? Let's speak about education. You talk about school zones and so on. Where does CRT fit into education? So, because you're a part of an education system, we are all a part of it.
Right.
And we see it over the years how we discuss race, we discuss class, we discuss prejudice and other things surrounding the entitlement or privileges of this in education. We teach not just math and science and so on, but we teach students to critically think about these concepts. So how do you see this CRT's ideas and we call them the tenets of it? How do you see that fit into the education construct?
Right. I think the first thing that I would like to say about this is it's important for people to know. I think there's been such a huge debate as to like CRT infiltrating our classrooms, and we have certain people who have ran campaigns on banning CRT from the classroom. There's been no evidence to date that CRT, critical race theory, the theory itself, has been studied and integrated in K through 12 classrooms. This is something that's left at a college level and at a graduate level. But when we talk about the tenets of CRT, when we talk about understanding racism and pointing out racism, I think it's already in the American curriculum. When we talk about Martin Luther King, when we talk about the civil rights movement, when we talk about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, when we talk about all these things that came out of a specific era, we look at Jim Crow, we look at Black codes. This is just discussion of institutionalized racism. Like this at its, if we were to look at it from a purely above ground view, from a bird's eye view.
Oh, okay,
Right, we could say that this is a small amount of what CRT is, and we're already doing that in our classrooms by just talking about the I Have a Dream speech and mentioning Malcolm X's fight and mentioning the civil rights movement. I think it's an interesting component, to say the least. Is a good lens, at least in my particular view, for us to view education. I think people are very concerned about CRT and public education, and education has become a matter of public concern, and it's been this way for decades. We can go back to the Reagan administration when we have the report of A Nation at Risk coming out, sort of trying to get Americans incentivized to like be involved in public education, and to at its core, not to be reductionist, but to A Nation at Risk was just really a call to Americans saying like, hey, we're concerned that America's falling behind, and we must be the #1 nation. We can't fall behind other nations in education.
Yeah.
And then then we have A Nation at Risk after, for Reagan. And then a couple, maybe like a decade or so, a couple of years later, we have a No Child Left Behind.
Yeah.
Administration, right? And it's this concept of, again, getting the public involved, getting the public to care about the fact that, yes, we're not going to leave a child behind. And this is the government's effort in producing education policy that's going to be encompassing, and it's going to galvanize the troops and essentially get people involved in this. And then right after Bush, we have Race to the Top from Barack Obama. And I think it's all these different critical components that we have, where we have federal government being involved in the discussion of education, trying to get the American people involved in this discussion. And the fact of the matter is that critical race theory is, if we look at it and we analyze Race to the Top and we analyze A Nation at Risk and we look at No Child Left Behind, these policies, using a critical race theory lens, like we can see what group was disadvantaged and what group was advantaged, and how we can even out these areas, and how we can provide without taking away from one group. I think there's this general fear that when we provide for one, we must take from the other, and that it's not true at all. I think we can provide without taking away from another. And it's about creating as equitable as possible an area of education where people of color can be heard, represented, and then they can also have a voice in what they're learning, and how they're being taught, and also understanding the history too. I think that's an important piece of critical race theory, is cementing race. I think one of the important tenets of critical race theory is the storytelling component. Because history is so much, we all understand that history is written by the victors.
You're touching all the points, because I was going to ask you about the storytelling. Yeah, continue.
And sometimes the voices of those people, because people of color weren't able to write, people of color weren't able to read, storytelling was a big component in the culture of African Americans in the United States. Stories were passed down from generations to generations. People couldn't read, people couldn't write. And this is how our history was passed down from the first people who arrived to where we are now. And the storytelling is a very important component of critical race theory because it challenges the notion of what's written, and it challenges what people consider to be true, and it provides an alternative reality, and one that actually includes all the voices.
Yeah, I love the idea of the storytelling component because we learned this. I grew up with my grandparents, and a lot of the things that I know and I come to value, which is a part of my value system, is through the storytelling component. And they didn't know that this was a part of some really ideal concept that they should tell us stories because it's going to develop value in us. But it actually worked. And so what I'm thinking of hearing from you, if teachers could start telling stories, find some time to tell stories just from the basic ground level, because teachers are in touch with students to tell them stories about their background and share stories in an academic setting, then students will start to realize that, okay, it's not the story of the victor alone, but it's the story of the victims too that we need to hear. Yeah. So the education in itself is very crucial to this idea of critical race theory and what it has to offer for everybody. So in the whole idea, the realm of things in education and policy, and you mentioned a lot about policy. Do you think we're getting better at exposing the wrongs and in a constructive way, not to beat people over the head again? But do you think we're getting better as a nation, as a people, to expose the wrong and also to correct this, especially during the month of Black History?
I think I would say we're heading in the right direction. And it may not seem like that because it feels like we're taking several steps backwards, but progress isn't linear. And I think that's important to understand that you may take 3 steps forward and 2 steps back, but you've made like if you do the math, you moved 1 step eventually, right? And that's still progress in itself. And I think having discussions is part of it, and that's the difficult component. That's where all the weird feelings live. That's where all the uncomfort and I don't want to talk about this, I don't want to face this. But I think I'm hopeful. I feel like there's a lot of good conversations that are happening around this, not just ours. But I think this has brought critical race theory to the national forefront of a lot of Americans' minds. And it's kind of just, and I think part of policy itself is the discourse piece, right? And it's bringing people to the table who don't normally agree on things to have a conversation, to have disagreements, and to be able to see each other's points of view. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about policy is that it's forever changing. It's not a one and done deal. I think we can make a policy today and revisit it tomorrow, and we're like, this didn't work out. But instead of scrapping the whole idea, we're just saying, hey, we have a policy that had 10 points. 8 of these points worked for us. The other 2 didn't. How can we ensure that we add 2 more points here that will work for everyone?
True.
And I think it's the fact that we're having discussions about this is an important thing to focus on. And it's something that we all need to be aware of. Like, we're having conversations about this. This is progress. The conversations may not be what we want them to be. Sometimes they may end in disagreement, and then we pick them up again another day and we pick up right where we left off. But it's I think the continued willingness of people to come to the table, especially people with differing views, and to sit and have conversations and discussions about this, and to really tease out their ideas and tease out the ideas of others, and have the dialogue that needs to be had. I think that creates for a more involved process that gives voice to everyone and gives a seat to everyone at the table.
Totally. I'm very glad we're having this, and I'm hoping that throughout the month, not just Black History Month, but people will have the conversation a whole lot more, so that we have more people to partake in the discourse and actually making changes as we get along. What I love is the fact that you said that if you have 10 points, 8 of them might work, but you have 2 that they need to go back and work on, because we're not perfect. And you're very, very correct. We're not perfect. Do you think that we need more people of color involved, especially in where policy is concerned? Do you think we have enough? What my question would be the representation. Do you think we need more representation in terms of people of color?
This is interesting.
Yeah.
Funny enough, I was reviewing W.B. Du Bois' Talented Tenth yesterday,
Mm-hmm.
and the whole premise was for him was to take the 10% of people, educate them, people of color, educate them, and have them go back to the communities and educate others. And in one point in his essay, he mentions that how amazing it must be for a child of color to see a Black educator in the classroom, to see a Black dean, a Black principal. Representation matters. And I think more now than ever, it's super important for people to have people of color in the conversation, to be involved in policy. It's one of the main reasons why I am studying education policy at Columbia right now,
Mm-hmm.
is because it's important for us to understand the policies. It's important for us to write about them, but it's important for us to bring our stories to these policies as well. And not to say that we can't have policy created by non-people of color. I think it's important to have those people as well at the table. But it's super important for representation. And I think it allows other people to see what's attainable and what can be done. And in that same mindset, I think how incredible must it be to be able to sit down, create a policy that works for your community and know that you were part of that. And it wasn't just another person saying, hey, I think this is what's right for these people, without being part of these people. And knowing firsthand, this policy, like No Child Left Behind, may not have worked for me. And let me tell you why. Let me give you that human component. Let me not just give you what's on paper and the statistics, but let me tell you what made it difficult. And I think a lot of the times when people are writing policy, they seem to forget or are making the shift now to realize, but there's a lot of intersectionality that comes with just being a human being. And then you have the race intersects with gender, and race intersects with class, and gender intersects with class. It's a lot of intersectionality. It's a lot of moving pieces. And you can't just write a policy for one group of people and not count other things that they have going on and other things that intersect and other components of their identity that are as integral as, to who they are. And I believe that's the important piece. I think, to your point, I think 100% representation matters, and we need to have more people of color in this field to be able to just say, like, here's my voice, here's my take, and let me be a representative for my people and tell you why this doesn't work. And it brings some sort of validity and kind of credibility to this discussion, right? Like, you can firsthand speak to it.
Yeah, it's true. Because me who grew up in poverty might understand what poverty feels like. So you could make some adjustments to policies for low income people, as compared to a rich person who have no idea what poverty feels like, what hungry feels like,
right?
Being hungry. Yeah. So we can say, no, they will not benefit from that. What you're doing there, it's not going to help the people who are below the poverty line. Also, for students who are suffering in schools because of what the curriculum, the type of vocabulary they might use in the curriculum. They might feel like these words, we're not supposed to use them with people of color, or so on and so forth. And it might affect their psychological development. Yeah, so you're very correct. So having representation there, it really matters, even down to the very small detail to help them. Before we close, I want you to reflect on your own experience in terms of a man of color and the direction in which we're going. And you mentioned that if we take 3 steps forward, sometimes we might take 1 step back or 2 steps back, but we still move. What does this mean for us or you as a Black person in America, going through this time now with all the development in like critical race theory, and after explain everything, asking for a seat at the table, getting a seat at the table, going through your own processes, studying. What does this mean to you, this whole idea of, oh, we're right here now and we can't get somewhere else?
I think at this current moment, and there's no denying that it's exhausting. I think it's a tiring aspect, and it feels redundant that this is something that we're doing again and again and again. But someone has to fight the good fight, right? And who better to speak about what we've gone through and than the person than the people who have suffered. And I think it's so important right now. Like, I feel like there's this apathy and this sentiment that, why are we doing this? This is not going to change. This is different. And I can tell you that back in the day, some people may have felt the same way. And there have been some setbacks and there have been progress. And I think my journey as a person of color, first of all, like, it was dealing with my identity and coming to terms with what my identity is and what it means. And then also, as a Caribbean person, my identity is very different back home than what it is here in America. And then understanding that component, that I have dual identity and that I navigate my identity very differently, and what I represent in Dominican Republic is very different than what I represent in the United States. But I think I feel very hopeful of the future. I think, having seen the discussions that we're having, and if we were in therapy, a therapist will call this moment a breakthrough, right? Like, when you get into the really heavy work where you're grinding and you're crying, you're sweating and you're upset. But at the end of it all, like, what comes out of it is the realization that the work was done and that we're doing the heavy lifting. But I think what's even more beautiful is how vocal white people have been in this discussion, and how white allies have been very supportive and have taken up the helm of being at the forefront and understanding, like, yes, this is something that we need to work on. This is something that we need to change. How can we change it? How can we help you change it? And I think allyship has been at an all-time high, and it's so important for us to recognize that and to applaud that work that our white allies are doing in support of this journey and this work that's happening. But I think, for me in particular, like, I'm very excited to be in education policy, to be figuring this out, to be working at a school where I can directly impact not just our white students, but our students of color, and where I represent an ideal for certain kids, and, like, oh, if Mr. Jimenez can do it, so can I. And I see a lot of myself in the children too, and just wanting to just attain for something higher. And I think that's the exciting component for me. I think the conversations we're having sometimes are uncomfortable, sometimes are painful conversations, but are conversations that should be had. And I think, for me, it's bringing us a little bit closer together. And some people may want to put a seed of, division and mistrust there. And I think we have to work twice as hard to get those out. But overall, I think the journey, I think we're on the right track. And I think, as a policy analyst or a future policy analyst, it's helping to open people's eyes to what certain policies are, and really kind of educate people. I think education is so important, and people are just looking up to others, and there are others who are taking advantage of that or not, or using it for their gains and their political gain. But I think there's a world of educators that should come out and really speak to it, and really speak to why this is important.
Yeah, totally agree with you. Yes, in the field of education too, we need more educators to talk. And I'm in Chelsea, Manhattan, and sometimes on the corner of the street, the people who are putting up placards that says Black Lives Matter, they're all older white women and men. There's not one Black person there, and they're on the corner saying Black Lives Matter. We need to save our lives. Everybody matter. Right across there. And I'm saying, this is the turning point, as you said, that sometimes you have white people standing up for a common cause. that we need to change. I
Mhm.
want to thank you so much for coming on. And I want to also thank our viewers for watching. This is EduTALK, and we're celebrating African Diaspora Series throughout the month of February. This year, we're featuring African Diaspora Series. Next week, by the way, we're discussing this evening critical race theory. Next week, we are going to look at what does it mean to be Black? What is Blackness? And how do we view ourselves as being, when they refer to us as, advancing in Black? Black advancement or Black empowerment, what does that mean? Black. And the last week, we're going to look at all the different people we haven't been focusing on, not many people in education focusing on, but they have contributed a whole lot to Black history. And we're not talking about Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Marcus Garvey, Nelson Mandela, and those people. We're talking about people, scientists and educators who have done a lot for Black history, okay? I want to thank Mr. Jimenez for coming on. Thank you for sharing. We enjoyed your conversation. I actually learned a few things about the tenets of critical race theory and what it means and how we can apply it to education as well as our own personal lives. So thank you so much for coming on. Everyone, I would ask you to go visit educationsolutionsinternational.org and subscribe to our page for updates. You will receive updates from us periodically, and initiatives that we have going on right through every month. We have something going on, resources as well, events. You can also watch the recording of this video as well as other videos, not just on Black History Month, but on a few other items relating to education and educational growth on Education Solutions International TV on YouTube, and also online on LinkedIn as well as Facebook. Okay, join us again next week for another show. Remember, it's African Diaspora Series, and you will see us here again next week. Thank you very much, Mr. Jimenez and everybody. Before we go, I want to say a shout out to some of my students. Daniel, I want to say shout out to you because you watch us sometimes or probably all the time. And I also want to say shout out to Aya over there in Manhattan. Shout out to everybody who is watching us, and drop us your comments. We will give you a shout out as well on our show. And anytime you want to share, we'll find some time to share as well from you, okay? All right, everybody, take care, and we will see you soon. Take care. Thank you so much, Mr. Jimenez.
Thank you for having me. Good night.
All right.